of a series that's hosted by our Gender and Social Equity Community of Practice, which aims to deepen the knowledge and understanding of these issues within the context of the environmental challenges that we work on here at WRI. I'm not going to speak much because we're tight on time and we have these incredible experts that I want you to hear from. So I'm going to turn it over. We have the privilege of housing the the support unit for the NDC partnership. And I'm going to call on Rob Bradley, who's the director of the Knowledge and Research team of the NDCP, to give us some opening remarks. Rob?
Thank you. Thank you very much, Natalie, and thanks everybody for being with us here today. I'm in a similar position to Natalie in that you've got a really interesting and smart group of people just about to talk to you, and I'm conscious of standing between you and them. So I'm going to keep it relatively brief, but I did just want to say a little something about why the NDC partnership is involved in this and why this is an issue that has been so important for us. I won't go into the NDC partnership itself in great detail because my colleague Lisa Bowe is going to be talking about that as part of her intervention in a few minutes. But the partnership is now 84 member countries, 19 intergovernmental institutions, as well as a growing number of NGO partners, all working together to drive climate and development in an integrated way through the implementation of the nationally determined contributions under the Paris Agreement. Now, of course, that's an immense task, and it involves trying to align climate action with all kinds of different sustainable development dimensions. But the incorporation of gender equity into that process, is something that our members have identified as a particular priority. Now, why have they done that? Well, first of all, because I think as everybody in this room is probably aware, there are strong gender dimensions to climate change and the impacts of climate change itself. Women are often disproportionately impacted. They work in particular sectors and activity types that are vulnerable to climate impacts. They have less power in many of the political and decision-making structures, and those leave them vulnerable. But there's much more to it than that, because what countries are increasingly recognizing is that to take a comprehensive, efficient, and effective and sustainable response to climate change means harnessing the whole of your society. And that means finding ways to make sure that people of all genders, as well as all other kinds of disadvantaged groups, are brought into the decision-making process in a way that means that everybody's bought in and that action is then sustained over time. It's an immensely challenging task, and nobody so far has really got it right. But what we are seeing is really encouraging signs from our partners and our member countries that they are actually formulating genuine legislative proposals. They are structuring their implementation processes to include the right kinds of stakeholders. We're starting to get some of those goals and some of the language lined up right. There's still a big gap between that and the level of implementation on the ground that will mean that we actually have an effective response to climate change that treats all genders equitably. But nevertheless, it's important progress. The other thing that's encouraging is that as part of the partnership, we have such an immense wealth of partners who are doing such advanced thinking on this topic and are active in so many parts of the world. And that's why we're excited today to give support to this event. Most of the folks you'll hear from today are part of organizations that are either part of the partnership directly or are people that we collaborate with on all kinds of research and learning activities. The important thing for us to bear in mind as we go through all of this is a certain sense of humility. None of us really has a comprehensive idea of how to get through this. But what we do have is an incredible wealth of activity out there, a range of resources, a diversity of resources, and in many cases, the role of the partnership is to help some of our members, some of our countries navigate the sheer diversity of those. And that's enough from me. The dialogue you're going to hear today is very much part of what the partnership hopes to support and hopes that we will help feed into what countries are doing as we go forward. And that ultimately climate change itself and the process of addressing climate change can be one of the means through which countries can take a serious effort at improving gender equity in their societies. Thank you.
Thanks, Rob. So I've been trying to get this group of people together for a couple of years now. I've been very excited. They're really busy. So I'm thrilled that we can have them all together in the same room at the same time, especially leading into a COP. So I think it's really important that we go into that with an understanding of what the issues are related to gender, because a lot of times the buzz is much more around the technical aspects, and this can get sidelined. But I think it's really important that we all know what the issues are and can really advocate for them in the way, whatever way we can. So I want to introduce our panel. I'm going to give you a brief introduction because I think their comments will speak to their expertise. Start with Fleur Newman, is the lead officer of the Gender and Climate Agenda item under the UNFCCC and responsible for supporting the integration of gender considerations across the thematic areas of the Convention and Paris Agreement. Fleur was previously a corporate lawyer working for a decade in the areas of climate change, sustainability, energy, and international law. Through her career, Fleur has been advocating for gender equality and women and girls empowerment and supported the development of the Lima Work Program on Gender and UNFCCC's Action Plan. Fleur, do you want to come on up? They'll speak afterwards. Varanya Chow is our next speaker. She's the program specialist for climate change, gender equality, and inclusion on the climate change team at UNDP, and the focal point for gender responsive NDCs. For over 10 years at UNDP, Varanya's work has focused on the integration of gender equality and women's empowerment into national planning and capacity building processes. She previously oversaw the environment, energy, and climate change portfolios in the Mexico country office and is now spearheading the piloting of gender-responsive NDC implementation in 10 program countries. Next is Leanne Shalatek, the Associate Director of the Heinrich Boll Foundation, North America. Leanne has extensive experience in global governance, specifically international trade and finance, as well as the promotion of gender equality and women's empowerment. A particular interest of her work has been awareness and capacity building on the need to integrate a gender perspective into macroeconomic policy. Currently, her work focuses on international climate finance with an emphasis on equitable access to climate funding and addressing the gender dimensions of climate change, including with respect to climate finance. Leanne has been instrumental in organizing civil society input into the development of the management plan and gender strategy of the Green Climate Fund, and she continues to represent CSOs and coordinate CSO input as a CSO active observer for developed countries in the GCF. Leanne? Lisa Bowe is the head of knowledge services for the NDC Partnership Support Unit, where she leads the unit's work on peer-to-peer learning and knowledge engagement with Asian countries. She also provides strategic and monitoring and evaluation support, with gender as one of the 4 priority focal topics for the knowledge and research team of the NDCP. Lisa is spearheading efforts to facilitate the knowledge and capacity needed by NDC member countries to increase, strengthen, and effectively implement gender-related commitments. And finally, on the line, I don't know if we have a video of Bridget. Bridget Burns, who's going to join us hopefully remotely here, is the director of the Women's Environment and Development Organization, or WEDO. Bridget specializes in policy advocacy, research, and movement building at the intersection of gender equality, women's rights, and environment and climate justice. For several years, she has been particularly focused on integrating gender equality into the decisions and outcomes of the UNFCCC. In addition, Bridget serves as the co-focal point of the Women and Gender constituency, which supports the political participation of women's rights advocates into the climate process. So Fleur's going to start us off. Each of our presenters will take plus or minus 10 minutes. I'll be cutting them off because we want time for questions. We're going to try and preserve at least 20 minutes, hopefully more, for your questions. So, sorry, yes, the clicker. So Fleur will.
Thank you very much, and thank you for the invitation to be here. And I was delighted that my travel arrangements aligned with the stars, and we ended up being here in the room today. I'm just going to give you a little bit of an overview of the international process and where we are at the moment in terms of gender in the context of the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change and the Paris Agreement. So, What we have is originally the original decision under the convention related to quite a narrow focus on the integration, the number of women who were actually participating in the UNFCCC process. So there was a recognition that there was a disparity and that there ought to be more women participating, and that was in 2001. 11 years later, we had another decision which looked at the fact that there were not enough women in the UNFCCC process and we still needed to be doing something about it. But what that decision in Doha also did was create a standing agenda item under the convention on gender and climate change, which is a very important milestone, because what it did was create focus, and it also helped the Secretariat in order to be able to support what was then being identified as a priority for parties. Prior to that, it was very difficult for the Secretariat to drive any change because this is a party-driven process. But once we had an agenda item, it became much easier for us to create that support. It was also the year in which we started actually collecting data and reporting on the gender composition, not only of the delegations, but also of the constituted bodies, which are the decision-making and technical bodies under the process, and also in the bureaus, which are the decision-making bodies of the process. So it was an important decision, and everything else has flowed from there, including the first work program, which was in Lima in 2016, and that had a particular focus on raising awareness of the linkage between gender and the thematic areas under the convention, so adaptation, mitigation, technology, finance, capacity building. 2015, we have the Paris Agreement, and this is the first multilateral environmental agreement which includes human rights language, which also includes a reference to gender equality and women's empowerment. And there are specific areas on gender within the chapter in the articles on capacity building and on adaptation, which is also reflective of how gender has been perceived in our process. So between 2001 and 2012, there were a number of decisions in relation to adaptation and particularly in capacity building. 2016 in Marrakesh, we end up with a 3-year work program, which is taking us a lot further into implementation of gender in the context of climate policy. And last year, the Gender Action Plan, and I'll talk a bit more about that in a moment. So we are in the process of the 3-year work program. It goes until 2019, and this is the first year of the Gender Action Plan. This is a graph of the number of, there's over 60 decisions which either refer to women, gender equality, social or socially responsible policy within the decisions and conclusions of the various bodies, the governing bodies and the constituted bodies under the process. We are now at the stage where we have taken all of those decisions and we have a Gender Action Plan. And the Gender Action Plan isn't new mandates. It's intended to be a how-to guide for all of the 60 decisions that came before it, because there's a recognition that if you have a look at the nature of those decisions, many of them were repeated. So a little bit like we took 11 years to get from saying we needed more women in the process to a decision which said we still need more women in the process. A number of the decisions actually repeat themselves because there was an understanding that this is where we wanted to get to, but not necessarily being implemented. So one of the things about the Gender Action Plan is that it's intended to support the implementation, the how to get to where we need to get to. And it has 5 priority areas. So the decisions, it took a year to develop this action plan, and there was a process of identifying the sort of clusters that made sense in terms of what was trying to be achieved. And so we have capacity building, knowledge sharing and communication is one priority area. Gender balance, participation, and women's leadership, because clearly we still have an issue there. Coherence, and this is coherence across the UNFCCC process, across all of the different thematic areas, but also across the UN system, because obviously gender equality is not only being dealt with in the context of climate change, but other sustainable development areas, and so there's a need for us to look at that more coherently. Then we have gender responsive implementation and means of implementation. And in this context, means of implementation means technology, capacity building and finance, and then monitoring and reporting. Our process is one that is based on data and reporting. So if you don't report on it, if you're not collecting data on it, it doesn't exist. And so this is a very critical component. I'm not going to go through all of this detail. I have put it in there because these slides will be available afterwards for information. Needless to say, in this first year of the Gender Action Plan, there's been a lot of action. And we've done a lot of work around capacity building and that is included capacity building of constituted bodies, the members of constituted bodies, to help those who are working in the process understand the linkages, because we can't assume that bodies are going to, that people working within the process are going to make those connections. There's a very important component of the monitoring and reporting which relates to the need for us to have much better data. So there is a request for submissions, and we've had a workshop on this, and there will be a synthesis report on this next year as well. And there's three components to that. The first is around the differentiated impacts of climate change on women and men, with special attention paid to local communities and Indigenous people. This is critical because we do have data on the differentiated impacts, but often that's done at a project level, and what we need to be moving to now is an economy-wide understanding of these differentiated impacts. And this is not just about women. This is also about men, and in different contexts that men will be in a vulnerable group in the context of climate change. And so it's important that we have data that reflects that. And then we also don't have good data at the moment on the integration of gender considerations into the various thematic areas under the process. And this speaks to what countries will need to be doing for their nationally determined contributions. So what we need to understand is actually what's happening at the moment in terms of gender integration in climate policy. And that will help us inform and support countries as they try to develop it into their NDCs. And then there's a piece on, again, gender balance in national climate delegations, a recurring theme. There's a lot of relevant activities, and I've put these in there to also because the Gender Action Plan relies on partners, so partner organisations to be supporting not only countries but also to be contributing to things like capacity building and knowledge awareness. So there's a whole lot of activities there that where inputs from organisations are important, and I would encourage everyone to go and read the Gender Action Plan. It's only a couple of pages long, although it was a couple of pages long, and that's a problem in our process. They like to have decisions which are only a page long. But it is useful if you can go and have a look at it, look at how the organisation can contribute to the various aspects, particularly in relation to the data aspect, but also in relation to the knowledge and the capacity building. And I'm going to leave it there.
So next we'll have Varanya. You can compare. Okay, great.
Thank you. Can I? So good afternoon, everyone. So I'm going to talk about mainstreaming gender within the NDC process, the nationally determined contributions, which mainly is national climate action, or actions that countries have committed do in order to achieve the Paris Agreement. So let me just, yeah. Okay, so the nationally determined contributions process, or the NDC process, provides an opportunity to ensure gender-responsive climate actions if well addressed. And the reason why I'm saying this is because, as we know, there have been efforts of integrating gender equality and women's empowerment considerations into climate change actions, particularly at the project level. On adaptation and in some cases on mitigation, especially on efficient and clean stoves when it comes to mitigation. But however, these most cases tend to be small in terms of the scale and not necessarily linked or have the capacity to influence policy frameworks. And so as part of the NDC process, which requires an alignment of climate change efforts at the national level, could open the opportunity for countries to integrate gender equality and women's empowerment into climate actions more comprehensively. And however, there are challenges to overcome that we need to look at and also to identify the opportunities. And so in a study done in 2016, UNDP found that only 40% of countries made at least one reference to gender equality or women in their INDCs, and 35 countries referred to women's role in adaptation, but without a specific mention to key sectors or women's roles. And 18 countries recognized the role of women in mitigation, primarily in relation to energy emissions, sustainable or biomass energy, and livestock. But there is an insufficient or non-specific inclusion of gender equality, which underscores the need to support countries to translate gender equality intentions into concrete actions and policy. And in this regard, UNDP, with the financial support of the government of Germany, BMU, and part of the NDC partnership through the NDC support program, is collaborating with countries, governments, so that gender equality and gender equality and women's empowerment aspects are integrated into climate efforts, but looking at these two dimensions as a combination that needs to be factored in three specific areas: the governance, the planning, and the policy, which are key elements of the NDC planning and implementation process. Let me just, I think I can. Yeah, and so I'm going to focus on the country examples, because this work can support the inclusive national climate change actions, as well as to also achieve or support the combination of the climate change targets to incorporate them in a more broad aspects of sustainable development and related particularly to the SDGs. And in that sense, that can create a win-win scenario. So now I'm going to focus on the country examples, looking at these three areas that I was mentioning that are interconnected. So the governance, the planning, and the policy. But also let me start by introducing a key element of the process, which is the gender analysis. The gender analysis, it's particularly important because it will help in addressing some of the gaps and the lack of detailed information on gender in the INDCs that was faced during the preparation process. Mainly, the reasons behind that was that there is an emerging coordination between climate change units or ministries of environment and gender institutions, the lack of not readily available gender information during the development of the INDCs, and the limited participation of women's organizations and gender machineries within the climate change process. These did not allow for incorporation of gender equality issues as desired. So countries have now moved to conducting this gender analysis, and the gender analysis will help to better understand the gender differentiated impacts of climate change within key climate related sectors and where inequalities and gender gaps exist. This information will be useful for decision-making process to inform or influence climate policies that interrelate with other socioeconomic aspects, such as productive resources like land. And let me give you an example. Discrimination based on gender in terms of access to formally recognized property rights, as well as customary land tenure systems, increases women's vulnerability to the impacts of climate-related disasters like droughts. And also, for instance, women excluded from high-value crops that required individualized land ownership, which is not easily accessible by women, inhibits the opportunities to engage in more productive crops that increases their resilience to climate shocks. So there is a connection between the two dimensions that it's important to identify. And another example is the case of Ghana. So the analysis that Ghana conducted on the gender aspects found that the effect of unpredictable rainfall in areas in the north of the country, which practice rain-fed agriculture, has led to pressure on the young and mobile to migrate to cities, many of them young women who make now a precarious living as porters. So it has implications in the social and the economic dimensions. Looking at the first area related to the institutional frameworks or institutional arrangements and coordination mechanisms, countries are reviewing their current institutional frameworks to better align their climate change work to their NDCs. And as part of this process, some countries are considering to better articulate this work with other ministries, including gender institutions. So, for example, in Zambia, the Ministry of Lands and Natural Resources, which is leading the NDC process, is collaborating with the Ministry of Gender in integrating a previous effort that the Ministry of Gender was doing in developing a climate change gender action plan. And these two planning policies and processes are bring together by these institutional collaborations, which will ensure that other government ministries or departments, as well as the stakeholders, could be better engaged in this national process. I think I'm running out of time, so I have other examples that you will see in the presentation later on. But let me just move quickly to the planning aspect of the NDC work, which also has to do with how countries by looking at the needs of articulating the work that they have already been doing on climate, they need to align, this work to the NDC. And in that sense, it's opening up an opportunity to incorporate gender aspects into the NDC plans or sectorial roadmaps that countries are doing. So we have the case of Ghana or Kenya that are currently looking at these aspects. Now, there are some challenges that remain, and which is particularly the focus of women as a group of vulnerable populations, rather than also strengthening the agency of women as consumers and producers and key actors of climate sectors. I think I'm going to have to go to okay, so I think I have a couple of minutes more. So let me just give you like a few examples, and let me just go back and just a few examples of the relevance of looking at women not only as a vulnerable group, but also as active agents of change and also decision makers. So look, it makes a huge difference of looking, for instance, at the different groups categorized generally as women as key leaders in different aspects. For instance, as entrepreneurs and promoters of clean rural household lighting and other clean energy products. There are very interesting experiences, for instance, in India in this regard, or women as decision makers, particularly in rural areas, regarding the promotion, for instance, of energy efficiency through the substitution of electronic appliances, or agriculture resilience building in climate vulnerable landscapes, where women play a critical role in many regions, and particularly, for instance, in Africa. So there is an important point to make, that these planning processes should look at the different groups in a more proactive way in a sense. Now, let me just then go to the policy area. And here it's interesting to see how countries are identifying different policy instruments to integrate gender, such as the national adaptation plans or the RED strategies or the national communications, and to a lesser extent, instruments associated to mitigation, such as the nationally appropriate mitigation actions, the NAMAs, and the low emission development strategy. However, there are some examples. For instance, I would like to just to point to the case of Uganda, where they are working towards integrating gender into its green school NAMA, which is about efficient cook stoves in a more massive scale in the different schools. And in this regard, the NDC process offers the opportunity of better articulating these instruments and aligning the efforts towards a more coherent framework. So just to perhaps conclude here is, so the examples that I shared with you showcase the importance of coordinating and connecting the interlinked processes of climate change and gender equality at the national level, which is the focus of the NDC process, which will promote inclusive and successful outcomes, and not only looking at the specific climate change targets, but also, as I was mentioning before, to accelerate sustainable development outcomes overall. So I'll leave it there, and you can find more information in our website. Thank you.
Thank you. Now Leanne will give some insights on the financing side.
Thank you very much. So I'm really excited to be here, and I start out with an apology. I have horrible slides, so I do really, really bad PowerPoints. I warn you, it's very text heavy. I will speed through it. I'll see it as a resource that some of you that might be interested can look at it later. And again, this is certainly not how I'm spending a lot of my expertise and knowledge and producing great PowerPoints. So again, this is just as a little apology. I don't want to spend much time on this one. I'd rather reserve it on talking about the financing. And I'm hoping that at least in this room and with the audience that we have online, we don't need to contest anymore. We don't have any deniers of the fact that climate change and climate finance is not gender neutral. So we can skip that one. So I think that points then right away to the need for gender responsive climate funds and funding mechanisms. And I would lay out two main reasons for that. One is that funding decisions, climate finance is not made within a normative vacuum. Fleur talked about the coherence, the UN-wide report, but even outside of the UN, the parties to the UNFCCC are for the most part, with some unfavorable exceptions, including the US, also signatories, for example, to CEDAW on other human rights and women's rights instrument. The second one, I think Rob alluded to, using scarce public finances in an equitable, efficient, and effective way is crucial. We simply cannot afford to internationally ignore 50% of the world's population, and particularly, and that goes to the point of the agency, the capabilities, the approaches, the knowledge that they have to bring us forward. So it's not just a victimhood, which is usually recognized in focusing very much on the adaptation and maybe on the communication piece, but it's particularly and exclusively a question of highlighting their capacities and abilities, which is why the integration into technology in finance is crucially important, and where unfortunately the Paris Agreement, despite the wonderful preamble, is still a little bit lacking. So what is positive? We have made progress with the gender integration in relevant public multilateral climate funds. So the Green Climate Fund, the Adaptation Fund, the Climate Investment, all of those have explicit gender policies and gender action plans with various efforts of mainstreaming successes. However, and I think this is a crucial point because it speaks to the larger question, how are we actually going to implement gender responsive climate financing? The structures of these funds provide very little access to finance for women, and I think in all of that we need to go beyond just a parties approach, but actually look at citizens and communities, women as a group of key stakeholders and what they can do. And so they are not prioritizing women as direct beneficiaries. where am I? So I wanted to put just a couple of examples out. For example, the financing landscape for renewable energy. So we know costs for renewable energy technologies have come down, but a lot of the clean energy solutions are still very often from the commercial sector perceived to be a riskier investment with less guaranteed returns. So I think there is a very important role for public climate financing instrument to address that risk and return misperception. However, public finance for renewable energy is still very often biased still towards larger scale on-grid solutions where you often have energy provision that is focusing on industrial or export activities. So issues then like the affordability of access, addressing energy poverty is not sufficiently taken up by the climate finance instrument and the climate finance structure that we are seeing. And part of it is actually who is doing the implementation. There is an inherent bias, I would say, within a lot of major actors, and that includes, for example, the Multilateral Development Bank, to not really deal with all that small stuff because, you know, the transaction costs are high, the return on investments are smaller, and so big infrastructure investment seems like the thing to do. If you do the small scale stuff, and Veronia, for example, mentioned the cook stove, it's usually like a little fig leaf. You do a little bit of that, but what we really need is a massive aggregation of that, not a single leaf, but actually blooming foliage of small scale activities and prioritize them in financing and create the incentive structures for the financing and implementation partners to take that actually seriously. Public sector financing, I want to look at the adaptation focus, the question of grant permission, and I put there particularly small grants provision, because I think, again, it's key for communities, women's group to get that. So while we see an overall increase in finance for adaptation, and that is good, we also need to protect project eligibility for adaptation, including for full cost adaptation financing. It is actually for many communities that are implementing on the ground for women's context, it's actually impossible very often to make a clear definition between development and adaptation, and with thus, you know, articulate an incremental cost approach. So full cost financing and providing financing on adaptation, for example, via small grants approaches, is crucially important. Private sector, and we heard about the role of the private sector, and Verania mentioned that quickly. From a gender perspective, and in thinking about how to make climate financing for the private sector more gender responsive, it has to start and focus on micro, small, and medium-sized enterprises. And I like to say that that first M, the one that starts from micro, is really important in that context. Often you hear SMEs, but when you look actually how women entrepreneurs are represented, where they are disproportionately represented, or also take the informal sector as an important part into account, then it's micro. And it does matter whether you actually structure a private sector engagement program that takes, again, the need for micro entrepreneurs, women into account. The determination, so what are then, for example, determinants of a gender responsive micro, small, medium-sized enterprise approach? I think it points to the crucial role for domestic public and local commercial banks that act as financial intermediaries. It's a question of making sure that the concessionality in the form of subsidized loans that is extended to those financial intermediaries is actually passed down to the final consumer, not computer, in the form, for example, of a woman entrepreneur. And she might not have the collateral in the form of, you know, land rights or any other to actually assess that. So why can public finance provided then, for example, be that risk guarantee for a woman entrepreneur to access that kind of financing for renewable energy solutions? I want to spend just really quickly, because this is a lot what I do as a CSO active observer, working with colleagues on trying to make sure that the Green Climate Fund, which of course is a main implementation channel for climate finance under both the UNFCCC and the Paris Agreement, does so in a way that is overall gender responsive. So how does gender integration in the Green Climate Fund look? We know that the GCF was the first multilateral climate fund which had a gender mandate from the beginning, and that was largely due to very strong fights and supports within civil society that was engaging in the Transitional Committee. And I see, for example, David sitting here. He might recall some of those fights that we had in the Transitional Committee, making sure that gender makes it into the governing instrument. So we had a persistent lobby within the GCF to finally get a gender policy and an action plan. It was at the 9th board meeting, so you can tell it was not a priority, but finally we got to it, which is right now an interim policy, and it's currently under revision. And it's actually quite discouraging and disheartening to see that the supposed update of the policy that actually should be much more stronger on a human rights perspective, on a stronger obligation, both for the fund secretariat, but also for implementers and for the NDAs, the national designated authorities, get so much pushed back. And efforts, and I think this is what Fleur didn't mention, but which unfortunately is the case, to nationalize that back by saying, yes, there are women's rights, but they have a very special national context in my country with respect to climate change. And I think this is something that at least civil society actors have to be and have to be very strongly opposing, not to allow that washing down through a national contextualization. So a gender action plan, and this is what Fleur also mentioned, is important, but it's only half of the bill. The next of the bill is how do you get it into those operational policies, on key operational policies. And I would argue into each of the operational policies. What is true for the Paris Agreement, and again, there are efforts right now to think about the rule book as it's hopefully going to be approved at the COP24, and how to make sure that you have strong language on human rights and gender equality integrated there. But it's also true for the Green Climate Fund, where you said, yes, it's good to have a gender action plan, but more important is that you get it into the accreditation framework, into a results management and performance measurement, into actually the investment criteria that you are looking for when you are evaluating if a proposal is really a good proposal and deserves the funding by the Green Climate Fund. I just want to give you a quick shout out to the goal versus the reality. Again, we have made some efforts. We are nowhere near there. The governing instrument asks, for example, for work towards gender balance in both the secretariat and the board. The board, I think, is woefully unbalanced, but I would like to see that the currently only 4 female board members of 24 and the 4 alternate board members constitute the head of the board, and hopefully the more advanced thinkers, and that we, with a new board coming in early next year, might change that composition a little bit. And we also need improvement in the secretariat. And I'll do that as the last slide, because I know Natalie is giving me the evil look. And again, I have that much more explicit PowerPoint that I'm happy to share. What is happening in terms of gender in the integration of GCF projects and programs? What's working? What is missing? We have now 93 approved programs worth 4.6 billion since the last board meeting that just ended a couple of weeks ago in Bahrain. A project and program-specific gender and social impact analysis is mandatory, which is great because you have, for example, commercial banks under the now 75 accredited entities that have never had even a gender policy, and now have to think for the first time in putting forward a private sector proposal under the GCF what a gender integration might look in their project. It should include a project or program specific gender action plan. That is now made public, and we pushed very hard inside the civil society community to make sure that those documents are public, because otherwise they might not even happen. So the question of reporting and transparently accounting for what is reported, I think, is a key pressure that you need in order to actually get implementation done. So far, the board has been very reluctant to impose, for example, a condition for the approval of projects or proposals, even in cases where the gender integration is weak. I think we had 1 or 2 instances so far. We like to be the board more gender informed and say, you know, if you can do a right job with bringing that proposal forward, then maybe the proposal is not yet ready for approval. And lastly, when we look at the quality of the published gender assessments and action plans of the GCF, there are quite still a number of shortcomings, and I would just name a couple really quickly. Hopefully then still end on a forward-looking note, but I think it's important to also point out that the devil is unfortunately very often in the detail. Even a project-specific gender action plan is often only a list of activities, does not include indicators, does not include responsibilities, does not assign a clear budget or financial means for the implementation. You often have, and I think this is detrimental to the long run success of implementation, you often have stuff outsourced. So you have to submit the document, you get a consultant. The consultant provides you the documents, but it doesn't provide you with the ongoing capacity and knowledge building, including within your ministry, your accredited entity, your national designated authority to actually go forward and do better in terms of gender. So that is something that absolutely needs an improvement. And lastly, it's very often, and that absolutely has to change, still treated as an add-on activity. So you have your main project, then you think of 2 or 3 additional things that you can do to show kind of a gender lens. This is not enough. We need to go to a complete recontextualization of how we do projects, what we focus on, how we prioritize funding for them. And again, while we are not there yet, I think we have made quite a bit of progress. Just to show you, I'm not going to go through that. Some of the methodology, the questions that you could ask on trying to find out whether a project or a program proposal is actually taking gender into account. And then also some of the areas that you look for, particularly with respect to climate funds on a fund or institutional level. Sorry, is it clicking forward? On a national government's level and on the level of implementing entities. And I thank you for your attention.
Next, Lisa is going to enlighten us about the knowledge and capacity needed to make implementation happen.
That's a big task. Hello, everyone. I'm so glad I'm one of the last ones to speak because everybody's already said all these valuable things, so I don't have to say as much. I'll take Leanne's lead on that. Okay, PowerPoint is up. And Rob has also already mentioned how basically the partnership functions, that we're a coalition of 100 plus members of countries and institutions, and that this, the value of the membership is in its members and what they can offer in terms of their expertise and all the capacity building support that they can provide. So as the partnership, we aim to basically accelerate climate action, reach Paris Agreement goals. But also we do that in a couple of ways. The first is really through our in-country support, where we're trying to provide, facilitate coordination of NDC processes through a country-driven process. And then on the other work stream we have is really on sharing knowledge. How do we do that? 3 primary ways are through our knowledge portal, which provides a lot of tools and resources for NDC implementation, including more recently on gender resources, and then looking at peer-to-peer convening so that countries can have frank exchanges with each other to share what works, what are they doing, what works, what doesn't work, and how do we improve. So we try to take a very pragmatic approach in making sure that there are, I forgot about this, that there are solutions being discussed and learned and actually going back into the planning and programming process. So I just wanted to show you, these are our 80 plus members, and then we have all these institutions with all the the wonderful expertise, and of course we have many on the panel today, whom we collaborate closely with. So and also, as Rob mentioned, we're we're basically looking at, the focus on gender is basically to create more sustainable, equitable impact for climate action. We see that happens. What Barani had mentioned with, the agricultural example. How are we reaching food security? How are we actually making sure that there are livelihoods for women and men in a more equitable fashion? So that's one of the reasons we focus, but it is, as Rob mentioned, the one of the guiding principles of the partnership, and one that bridges the sustainable development and the climate agendas quite nicely. So what have we been doing? We've been on gender. We've been undertaking a series of activities to look at how gender has. Or rather, what some of the key challenges are in reaching gender-responsive climate action. So we commissioned a scoping assessment, and our consultant is actually here, so she can add in at any time. But we did have. I wanted to share with you some of the key findings that we had from this, which is that we have. And there are various challenges and critical enabling conditions that allowed for more gender-responsive NDCs and climate programs. And you can see what we tried to do was elevate a little bit and sort of summarize what are the key problems that others are facing. Barani already mentioned quite a number of them. But there are some familiar things like the lack of sex disaggregated data and specific gender analysis, the kind of coordination mechanisms that actually don't work in tandem with each other for comprehensive gender equality integration. Then there's limited engagement of gender specialists, the lack of technical capacity, inadequate information to gender resources and tools. These are really things that, or the lack of access to it, but also the lack of uptake or knowledge about these gender resources. So similarly, the limited knowledge sharing. And so there's also on the flip side and the positive side, there are certain things that we've seen after this scoping assessment of 6 countries. It was a small assessment, but it actually did come up with what are the things that have worked and have allowed countries to be able to support more gender-responsive climate action. And one of the key things was political commitment. So we you see that in many places, but in countries like Uganda and Kenya, where it's fully integrated into their policy frameworks and plans, that has been a strength. Also with the Marshall Islands, where despite having a small human resource capacity, they're able to now put human rights and gender, is that it? Okay, front and center into their what we call our partnership plan, the coordination mechanism that for NDC implementation on the ground that the NDC partnership supports. So that's a very key aspect. Then the other aspect is institutional arrangements. Also, I'll refer to Kenya and Uganda again, because they have focal points and a gender machinery that's very elaborate, that provides the kind of support needed. But even still, they have some additional issues with having that translate into reality. But at least the basic infrastructure of gender staff are there to raise up the issues and make sure that the interests are represented. The other key feature is participatory consultations, and you saw that. You saw that quite clearly in the case of Peru, where there was multi-stakeholder consultations that engaged not only women's groups, but it addressed intersectionality issues. So it engaged indigenous groups as well as others who were marginalized. And so, looking at gender is also a window into expanding inclusive approaches more broadly. The other issue was technical capacity. So once there was technical capacity on the combination of gender and climate at the various levels, it really propelled the kind of integration and substantive changes in programs and policies that actually made a difference to people. So I think that's really key as well. And I think as as Leanne just mentioned, the financial resources is a huge constraint, and it's the number one thing we hear from countries all the time. We just don't have the financing for it. And as you said, the kind of financing that's needed is not only at the macro level, national level, but it's at that lower level where you have the local banks and others that are not financing or can be financing the kind of initiatives that support more gender equality. So let me go on to the next. I think I will skip this, but this will be on the slide. But these are some of the basically the kind of demanded tools from some of the countries. So for those who are looking for things that they can build on in terms of what they provide as a donor or as an implementing partner, these are some of the key things that that is highly demanded by countries. And then, like I mentioned, the three things that we have been doing to support knowledge sharing and learning among countries on NDC implementation is the knowledge portal, the peer convening, and doing knowledge products, which tries to share broad lessons, success stories, case studies where you have actual examples of what it takes to actually have a gender responsive work. So in some of our convenings, we held a convening just last couple of months ago, and it echoes the same things of what are some of the key success, the enabling conditions for gender responsive NDCs, and so the same ideas about political will, participatory processes, climate finance, data, and raising awareness. But there were some interesting things that were mentioned there too, that small actions can lead to big changes. And so there was a reference, for example, from Peru to say that women-only focus groups are really important to have when you're doing consultations. Then having childcare, because noting the double burden of women when it comes to getting their active participation. Okay, so what are we doing with regard to our knowledge portal? We have a portal that provides knowledge tools and guidelines and resources for NDC implementation broadly, but for gender resources, we've recently expanded the set of resources working in collaboration with the UNFCCC to make sure that their gender knowledge platform is included in the resources, but because there's so many resources, we try to curate it so that it's simpler for people to access, easier for people to tag and search for the different types of tools that they might need, for example, in a specific sector or if it pertains to a particular region. So that is going to be launched at COP. And so we hopefully you'll be able to access that then. We also have a case study database that's done in collaboration with GIZ, LEDS-GP, and UNDP. So that is also is an important thing. The last slide I will go over is basically what we hope to do. In terms of what we hope to do as a partnership is to continue to document what the learning needs are and to communicate that out to the partnership members so that they can respond to those needs. Given the massive amount of capacity building support and resources that are available, we're going to continue to curate gender resources on the knowledge portal to make sure it's easier to access and really look at encouraging uptake of those resources, working in collaboration with our members. We also want to put together an expertise directory on gender, because we hear over and over again that there simply is not the kind of technical capacity at country level, and that needs to be built. And so we want to be able to expedite that and have that readily available. Continue with the peer exchanges, case studies, and deliver knowledge resources in tandem with the in-country capacity building. And the last thing I wanted to mention was that because the NDC partnership sort of sits at with a bird's eye view with different partners, what we hope to do is to gather our members and come to an agreement on an agreed set of key services that countries need to make their NDCs more gender responsive, then try to get the different institutions and donors and other countries who can support to fill in those gaps as they need them, so that we can have a much more coordinated and harmonized approach to all of that. So I'll stop there. Thanks.
And finally, we're going to try to bring in Bridget Burns, who leads We Do, so she can share with us insights about the civil society movement to support all of this and really advocate for these efforts.
Can you hear me?
All right. Should I turn this off? Yeah, go ahead. Okay.
Hello?
Go ahead.
You can. Okay, great. Thanks so much. Thank you, everybody. It's really a pleasure to be on here, and thank you for allowing me to join you this way. I think that one of the things that's so nice about seeing and hearing from everyone in this room is it really speaks to what I think is an important and coordinated strategy that we have as multiple different organizations really trying to work to enhance this integration, to enhance both gender equality and climate action, and doing this in different ways at different levels. And I'm going to speak today from the perspective of, sorry, excuse me, just got control, of a feminist organization, so a women's advocacy organization, and how we as civil society have tried to work in a coordinated way, and also looking specifically at both environment issues as a whole, and also particularly on climate change, to create more space for enhancing and advancing women's rights. So we do, I thought I would do that just by sharing quickly with you the what We Do does, and how we do this work, and the strategies we have for making an impact, and also what needs that we see are still are coming out of this work that we're doing. And it really speaks to a lot of what's already been shared today. So We Do as an organization works towards two specific goals, and we work, of course, with them in tandem. The first being that women are empowered to claim their rights as decision makers, advocates, and leaders, particularly on issues related to environment and sustainable development. And so that lends itself to a number of different programs and projects that I'll speak to in the strategies that we use. But it really means that in any space that you can think of around climate environment, we try with our partners from around the world, women's groups, grassroots organizations, indigenous women's groups, to make sure there is a space for developing joint positions, joint perspectives, and bringing the experiences and lived realities of women who are experiencing this environmental degradation, who are speaking and saying no to different types of projects or investments that are happening in their communities, and linking it back to the global process and vice versa. The second goal is to ensure that sustainable development policies, plans, and practices are gender responsive, environmentally and socially just, and effectively implemented. And I think one of the unique roles that We Do plays is that we find ourselves often doing work and conducting advocacy strategies within processes like the UN climate negotiations or the Green Climate Fund, working, of course, with Leanna and others. But also we find ourselves in spaces like the Commission on the Status of Women, or looking at the World Urban Forum, the policy processes around disaster risk reduction, to ensure that this is a really holistic approach, and that these intersections are being seen and understood in a number of different spaces. So we find ourselves working to explain these intersections of women and gender and environment within environmental spaces, but also really, really importantly within feminist spaces itself. And a lot of that work is using strategies to connect what we're seeing in society and movements that we're part of with social and environmental science, and then linking that specifically to different policies at a global level. And WeDo was actually founded over 25 years ago in the early 90s at the start of, or at the precipice of the Earth Summit in Rio, where a lot of these conventions that we're talking about were born with this understanding that not only did we need to make sure that women were present in that space, but that women's rights and women's perspective were going to be reflected in the outcomes of what came from that Earth Summit. And that's really the work that we've continued doing over the last 25 years in different spaces. So one of the first strategies that we use is to create and generate intersectional knowledge. And I think this was spoken about from a number of the presenters before as a key strategy to making sure that we are linking what is being asked of us. So the evidence base or the data space that a lot of the policymakers that we work with are used to, and making those very clear links to the gender data that exists. And so one example of that was following not the most recent, but the previous IPCC report, and trying to take some of the key findings from that IPCC report and linking it to gender data that we know exists, and then also linking it to what kind of action could be created or is happening that links both this IPCC data and gender, and trying to, it's one thing to collect the data, and then it's another thing to make sure it's being read and utilized in a way that supports policy-making project development. So I think when we talk about the generation of intersectional knowledge, the first is that collection of that data, but then it's also making it available to, you know, everyone from grassroots activists to policymakers in a way that helps them develop their policies or projects. The second, and probably one of our biggest strategies, is through the direct advocacy and participation of women and women's rights organizations in policy processes, to learn them, to speak the language of them, and to try in every way to transform them without, very importantly, being co-opted by them. And so that, I think, happens in different forms. WeDo runs a program called the Women Delegates Fund, and this is kind of a very straightforward women's empowerment and participation program where we provide travel support and capacity building for women from countries, from least developed countries, small and developing states, negotiations training, and then also the support to attend the negotiations and be on their national delegations, trying to really combat the gender balance challenge that Fleur was speaking to, and as a program trying to enhance and advance the goal that parties themselves have set for ensuring that women are actually at the table and being part of these vital discussions on climate policy. The other aspect of this is making sure that women's rights, grassroots advocates are also able to be in these policy spaces and have a voice. And so part of that would include, it was mentioned before that I'm one of the co-focal points of the Women and Gender Constituency, which is a collective of 27 organizations that are officially members, or officially observers of the UN climate policy process. But that constituency runs an advocacy network of around 500 advocates that are coming from networks in different regions, and we work together to look at and examine what's coming up, let's say, in the climate process, and to set a key list of demands to figure out how to map power processes and advocate to different governments and make sure that we're getting the kind of outcomes that we hope to see. And it also means mapping what other spaces do we need to be in to have an impact, not just in, let's say, the climate space, but where we need to be to talk about trade, disasters, the role of the private sector within all of these pieces. And so again, it's trying to create that knowledge and that bridge so that there is not decisions being taken that isn't informed by or being responsive to the needs and experiences of women from around the world. And then finally, as part of that strategy, it's not enough to just be in those spaces and understanding those spaces, but really trying to create a whole range of tools to track and monitor what that looks like. So this is something that Leanna spoke about, and there's a lot of work happening to figure out how to track and monitor the Green Climate Fund, for example, the projects going through that fund, we do for the last year has been running a project called Women Demand Gender Just Climate Finance, which is combining strategies of both hosting webinars for women's rights organizations and women's funds to try to get them to better understand what these climate finance processes look like, and actually supporting the participation of women from different regions to attend the meetings to figure out how we can create feedback channels from what's happening in those spaces to different regions. And we also have something called the Gender Climate Tracker, which is an app. It's another example of the type of tracking that we've done, which is looking at women's participation and climate delegations, but also starting to track what has been presented here on national policies, and nationally determined contributions where gender has been integrated, and hopefully creating a process for the next few years where women's rights organizations can actually provide shadow reporting potentially on what's being done. So that speaking truth to power piece is a vital role, I think, that women's rights and feminist organizations play. And so just to conclude, I think that in moving to implementation, one of the things that is coming out of a lot of the regional, national consultations and meetings that we have been a part of is everything that's already been said here. The sex and gender data, to be able to do the analysis is something that's a constant, and what's really important is that it is a request for contextualized country-specific and even sector-specific sex and gender disaggregated data and analysis. And I think, when it comes to the NDC partnership, this is a really important potential role when we look at those, not just NDCs, but the national adaptation plans, where how can different types of organizations, from feminist organizations to think tanks, be helping to either provide this data or to make suggestions for partnerships and links to statistics, national statistics groups that should be happening in order to implement this in a better way. Intersectional capacity building and training and an integrated human rights-based approach. We've also been getting a huge amount of feedback on, this feeling that even where we are, that we've kind of moved and progressed from a space of what might have looked like an older type of gender mainstreaming and analysis, where people feel like it needs to have a broader intersectional basis. Of course, our advocacy has always been from a very intersectional perspective of trying to understand gender as a lens, but there really needs to be, I think, a stronger focus on that when it comes to national implementation, because that's certainly how people are seeing and feeling the impacts. And then the last thing I'll say is a combination of enhancing pathways for engagement for women's groups, gender experts, and national gender machineries. And this can just mean getting the right people in the room together to have them engage directly in these policy processes, development, et cetera. And then finally, really investing in any way that we can in feminist movements around the world, because at the end of the day, one of the common challenges that we hear is that there's persistent patriarchy across many of these societies and many of these cultures, and it's often really, really difficult, even when perhaps we've normalized or understood gender in a certain way at a global level, for then to that actually be implemented at a national level. And we know that one of the surefire ways of advancing gender equality is through the investment in feminist movements who are able to challenge and bring progress forward at national level. So I will leave it at that, and looking forward to questions.
Thanks, Bridget, and thanks to all of you. I hope that gave you a good overview, but hopefully a little more than just the top of the line. I think we went a little bit deeper so that you have some better insights. But with the remaining time we have, we can take whatever questions may have come up for you. So I'll let me bring the mics around.
Hi, thank you so much for the great presentations. It's great to see that this work is moving forward in so many different areas. I did want to ask the panel, my understanding is that the majority of this work focuses on cisgender women. And so my question would be, what steps do we now need to take in order to better integrate transgender and non-binary individuals into this important work?
Thank you for your good presentations. I'm from Kenya, so I'm happy to be here. We normally don't get this kind of opportunities to come and meet real people and listen to them. Real, I mean real, like from UNFCCC, from NDC, from Heinrich, you do a good job. You usually invite us to all your meetings, but in a nice hotel. So we go there because there's nice food, nice breakfast, you know. No, they talk about this gender thing, you know. But, well, I'm also from the Ministry of Environment and Forestry. I'm on holiday here, but when I saw all this, I was here yesterday and I've come again today. I think you are the greatest. WRI, please clap for yourselves. I'll clap for you too. Please clap for WRI. I wish you could extend this to other parts of the world so that even if it's on teleconferencing and stuff like that, but where people can go, maybe you can talk to one of these organizations that has a good office. AWF have a nice office. They have all these things. People can meet there and then participate in this. Now, this gender, thank you for the examples for Kenya and Uganda, but I think when you do the evaluation, you need to check, because we have like the Climate Change Secretariat. They have women in there, but you know there are some women who at heart, they think official, and not thinking official is thinking like men. We have the gender officers in ministries, and they may not be part of the secretariat. Maybe they're just invited when a visitor from WRI says, oh, we want to look at this gender thing, so they'll come and give a nice face there. But the gender officers, because they're the official people in the ministry, they need to be given training, even on negotiation, because they don't know. How do you negotiate for even women to participate? Most of the work is done by civil society. The working group on climate change will collect information from people from the communities, and then their representatives will bring it to the task forces where we sit and write all these policies. I thank God I've been part of all those processes, so I have participated. What Heinrich Ball said is so true, but I also want to complain because it goes beyond just participating in these things. You see, even when they advertise positions, including WRI, they say women candidates are particularly encouraged to apply. So we apply, nothing. There's nothing that comes out of that. So please stop doing that. Don't just say this position is specifically for women. Men, please don't apply. Okay. Call for proposals. The funding is specifically for women. Any other organizations do not apply. I mean, maybe that will work. Thank you.
And one more question before we go to the panel. Yes. So I just wanted to, and it's good to have somebody on the ground here. I am leading UNFCCC work in the BRI, but also with a NDCP hat. To try to escape from the negotiation bubbles sometime. And I wanted to know, however, how, so there's a gender action plan, but there's initiatives on education. There's the indigenous people platform. How we make them work together a little bit, more. There's different capacity building initiative. Again, it seems, it's great to see, as you said, a lot of things moving, but how to harness, all of those. And I wanted to understand a little bit more. And education and culture, I think for maybe, the UNDP person, how culture, is taken into account, and the social dimension. So we talked a lot about the lack of data. We tend to take this as, from a modeling, from a very mathematical, eventually point of view, but there's all these cultural and social dimensions and underlying, drivers. And I wanted to know eventually how, we engage into that as well. But thank you. I take this opportunity to thank you. It's great to see this happening.
Thank you. And where am I going to start? I'm going to start with the cisgender. Yeah, I mean, this question comes up sometimes, probably not as often as it ought to. One of the things is that, certainly from my perspective, one of the things I can do is ensure that when we have workshops, when we do things, I can make those more inclusive. We're still at a process perspective. It's beyond the capacity of the international process at this point in time to be able to expand out in a formal way, but certainly in an informal way and in the way in which we organise things, we can be more inclusive, and we do try, but there's a long way to go. On the issue of regional things, one of the things with the NDC partnership is there is a need for us to be able to engage at a regional level. From a secretariat perspective, that's challenging in the sense that we are based in Europe and we don't have regional offices, so we rely on our UN colleagues to where there are country offices, and we are looking at ways in which we have just done regional dialogue in Bangkok and one in the Caribbean, and these were looking at making sure that gender was included in a more systematic way in those. So we are aware that regional training is necessary, and in fact Bridget was recently in now I can't remember where she was, but looking at training for Francophone African women, because this is also another challenge, an inclusivity challenge, is the language issue, and making sure that we are able to provide for those who don't speak English as their first language. And so we also just on Monday had the first National Gender and Climate Change Focal Points webinar. So these are focal points who have been appointed by countries for their national delegations under the climate process. And for that first webinar, we made that available in all 6 UN languages. And that in itself is a logistical challenge, but it's something that we recognise is vital for ensuring that we're not just advancing this for some women, we're advancing this for everyone as much as possible. And I'm not going to answer some of the other questions or the complaints, and then in the last point about that's one of the reasons why one of the priority areas is coherence, because there's a recognition that it's not just gender under the gender and climate change agenda item, it needs to be everywhere within the process. This affects every aspect. And so one of the things we've been doing this year, it sounds kind of technical, but it's important because we're doing capacity building with the constituted bodies, and these constituted bodies are dealing with issues of technology, of capacity, of education, so we're starting in the process with those bodies because they have also an impact at a national level. But also, for instance, this year we have the dialogue on action for climate empowerment, which is the education and public participation component of the convention, and also picks up the same under the Paris Agreement, had a focus on gender. And in fact, in that one, we also made that more inclusive. So we also dealt with the issue of LGBTIQ vulnerable groups in that dialogue. So there is a recognition. We are starting that process, but this is only the first year of the Gender Action Plan, and we've still got lots of activities to do.
I wanted to come in just quickly on 2 of the questions or comments. First one was on the cisgender focus, and actually our own experience as civil society, for example, working in the Green Climate Fund, this is a very big problem. You might recall that I mentioned the stalling of the efforts to upgrade the current interim gender policy in the Green Climate Fund. A huge part of that stalling is language that goes beyond cis and, for example, acknowledges the reality of multiple or different gender identities. And then it goes back, I think, very, very keenly to what our colleague from Kenya had said. It goes back who makes the decision and whose position is more powerful than others. And if I relate that back to the Green Climate Fund board, there the pushback is from a couple of very outspoken developing country board members that are culturally from a region that has a very national contextualized understanding of women's rights and are pushing back on that. They are also at an age group, to be quite honest, where you can hoping that some of that perspective might change, for example, in a future composition of boards and when you improve the gender balance of participation, because I think it really changes the way you are having discourses. But at the moment, I'm actually, kind of encouraged if you see where we've gotten, for example, in the area of climate finance over a course of less than a decade from what has gender got to do with it. Literally, people laughing you out of the room, to now actually saying, yes, the main operating entities of the financial mechanism of the UNFCCC and the Paris Agreement, it's absolutely clear that they have to have a gender policy, that they have to have a gender action plan, that the UNFCCC have to have a gender action plan. And the question again is, what do you need in formal policies and what can you be doing through, maybe not so formal guidelines for interaction and just for broadening perspective and minds through interaction. So we are hopeful for the future on that. And then on the second part, I mean, the colleague from Kenya, again, I think the question is really when you're looking at who usually is the gender coordinator. It's a matter of power and the power structure within ministries that they are usually not considered to be powerful enough to be part of discourses, particularly when finance or national planning or anything like that is involved. Which is why I think it's very important to ensure that you work with gender focal points or gender coordinators that understand the technical language of the process, but also the other way around. And I think it's particularly the other way around. It should not be okay in a climate delegation for a guy to say, I'm dealing with finance. Let's send that little junior person over there to talk about the gender action plan. But he or other powerful negotiators need to understand it as part and parcel of what they need to do their job right. And if you're not getting to that kind of two crossway, yes, make sure that people that come from, a feminist perspective or gender advocates can understand and can be part of technical discourses, but also make sure that those very sector-specific technical experts understand that in order to do what they are setting out to do, they need to be mindful and aware of the gender part of it. Then we are not getting there.
Hello?
Go ahead, Bridget.
Okay, sorry. I'm sorry, everyone. I have to jump off, and so I just wanted in 1 second to say for the first question, the women and gender constituency in the UNFCCC process, what Fleur said is very true in the process itself, and the example Leanna gave is really important as well. We are, coming up against a lot of really, really challenging norms in even being able to get language on gender equality, and so there's a long battle to fight in terms of having a broader understanding of inclusion and of gender as a non-binary understanding, but that certainly within the constituency itself and the feminist organizing around it, that we have a much larger advocacy strategy. We have trans advocates within our work who come into those spaces, and we're trying to find every space that we can and dialogue that we can to broaden out the discussion of what we're having. And this really speaks to that last point I made of, because that's the international level, but this is coming up always at the national level, that that the structure that we have for understanding this at the international level really needs to be contextualized at national level, and the tools we use for gender mainstreaming need to be approached from a human rights perspective and in an intersectional way, because certainly in all of the regional processes I've been in, this question is coming up. And so that's why I think one of the needs we have at a national level is to develop, and not develop because they exist, but really use tools that look at gender analysis from a human rights perspective and in a very intersectional and inclusive way, because the sort of normative way that it's being discussed at the international level doesn't translate at national level in many different contexts. So I'll leave it at that. Thank you, everyone, and apologies I have to jump off.
Thank you, Bridget. Yeah, unfortunately, we have run out of time. We've gone over our time. So, Rana, did you have an input? Yes, sorry.
I mean, if possible, just to mention two things. So one, I think the relevance of the NDC as a process is that it really focuses on the national context. So it looks at the actors, at the frameworks, at the needs and the opportunities in very particular sectors and processes. And I think that gives a good entry point for gender equality with the different approaches that we could incorporate to that. And I do see that there is an important opportunity, for instance, of taking advantage of the progress that some countries have done in building capacities in their key line ministries, for instance, on gender. But definitely there is the need of linking the gender, the climate, and the particular focus of that sector together. And so I think that's something that will improve the coherence and the alignment. But I think this NDC umbrella could allow to a better performance in that sense. And just to also respond to the other question about the cultural aspects. That's why it's so important, the gender analysis, because it will gives the opportunity to decision makers to better understand what is the particular situation in a national context or into the key climate sectors in terms of the barriers and in terms of the challenges that they need to overcome and at the different levels and the key actors that are involved.
Thank you. And unfortunately, we don't have. Do you want to add to it, please? Go ahead.
Only there's time. I'll try to be very brief, but that didn't work for me before. So thank you very much from our Kenyan colleague. I just wanted to respond to that. We very much see that there are the different countries are in different stages of integrating gender, and I think with both Kenya and Uganda, they're much more advanced than other countries. So some are just at the beginning of the process. And I fully am aware of the issues that have come up, even though we have the gender language in the frameworks, and even though there is a gender focal point system and the national machinery is in place, still the reality of it is that the outcomes are not there. So and the country and many colleagues from Kenya and Uganda have expressed that already. So this is why we are looking at making sure they have the resources where you have gender expertise on tap, right? And information that can provide the kind of capacity strengthening for the country actors who are working on these plans, so that a consultant doesn't come in and just do the report, but it stays with the country. So we're trying to do things like that to provide the kind of streamlined inputs that would actually help to extend that into actual outcomes. We're trying, but we would love any additional advice on that. Thanks.
Thank you all so much. Clearly, we have a lot more to talk about and a lot deeper that we could go on each of these discussions. So, but unfortunately, we are way out of time. Thank you all for staying, and thank you to all of our speakers here. Please give them another round of applause. We'll make the presentations and a recording of this available on the event page. So if you saw that, you can go back there maybe in a day or two, and you'll be able to find that there. Thank you all for coming.
Thank you.